it is most appropriate that we take up the subject of the steep path to Christhood during this Holy Week, when Christians the world around commemorate the passion of beloved Jesus. We too now remember all of those many trials that came his way during that final week. Most especially those poignant hours in the Garden of Gethsemane. You may be tempted to consider that as you pass through the later stages of your own probationary path, that the choices that you have to make might appear to be quite clear, a stark contrast of black and white, right and wrong. This, however, will not really be the case, because the initiations all have to do with the ultimate trials of putting down the impulses of the not self and permitting the divine presence to reign supreme in your life. Some of the greatest of these trials come not so much overtly in the form of persecutions as they do in the form of temptations. You might recall that Jesus put that request in his Lord's Prayer: lead us not into temptation. Because of the great mastery that was his, there was no outer worldly force which could compel him to do anything, nothing that could really attack him and defeat him. He was wise enough and alert enough to realize that really and truly the only possible avenue of his own downfall would be through something that would come to him sideways as a temptation, as an allurement, as even the rationalizations of his own mind, the voices acting within himself. These things are far more subtle than one might suppose. Many of them have to do with physical earth plane trials associated with the exercise of the quality that God is doing, most especially in the physical plane. We asked and answered the question earlier in the week: what is your mighty I Am presence doing through its heart flame in the physical body? And we answered that the presence is mastering will, both the decision-making freedom of free will, but also mastering the impulse of will and power, the blue plume of the threefold flame. Many life streams can go far on the path, so long as they feel as if they must really exert themselves, so long as they are in distress. but it becomes another situation altogether as soon as the liquid light flows through as divine power. And then comes the question whether or not that great power flowing back into the world of the individual is going to water those atrophied aspects of the mortal self that have shriveled up for lack of power, but have not yet completely gone into the flame. It is an astonishing phenomenon that power of all sorts becomes an intoxicant that will lead the consciousness astray if one is not ready. At the beginning and the end of the public ministry of beloved Jesus are trials, all of which have to do with the challenge of temptation in the area of power and the exercise of free will. Take the ones at the beginning of his ministry, when, having been baptized and full of the Holy Spirit, he went into the wilderness and fasted and prayed for 40 days. Of course, the Old Testament understanding and the New Testament carryover was that it was some external demon or evil one or Satan that stood before him and tempted him in that way. There is no such thing as a devil, except the unredeemed, untransmuted substance of each life stream's own energy. So when it states that the tempter spoke to him, it was the voices of his own four lower bodies that were speaking to him. It is important enough along the way of your initiations for us to take a closer look at this one more time. And Jesus, being full of the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, being 40 days tested by the tempter. And in those days he did eat nothing. And when they were ended, he afterward was hungered. And the tempter said to him, "If you be the Son of God, command the stone that it be made bread." On the one hand, you have the crying out, the natural hunger of the physical body. But on the other hand, you have the mind, which is saying, after all, you have this power. You, after all, are the Son of God. You can do whatever you want to do. And in this case, just snap your fingers and cause the stones to be made into bread. Note Jesus' response. It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth from the mouth of God. In all of these temptations, by the way, he prefaces his response by a reference to the law of Moses and the events that took place with Moses, stating, "It is written." And there is actually a way that you can go back to exactly where it and when it is that God, speaking through Moses, said, "Thou shalt not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth from the mouth of God." Putting the impulse of his mighty I am presence as the word coming forth from his presence ahead of the intellectual temptation to do this, as well as the hunger of the physical body. Then, taking him into a high mountain, the tempter showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time, and said, "All this power will I give you, and the glory of them, for it is delivered to me, and I may give it to whomsoever I will. If thou therefore wilt bow down and worship me, all shall be thine." And Jesus answered, "Get thee behind me, for it is written, Thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve." In this passage, it again is the ego that is talking, that says, capitulate to my usurped power, which has been there since the fall, and then you will shine before everyone else. You'll notice in this case, Jesus again quoting Moses says, "Thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve." Putting the mighty I am presence first, the adoration to the presence first, and recognizing that the service is only to that God presence. For those who might be new to the teachings of the Ascended Masters and coming out of a Christian background, worried about committing the sin of idolatry because the word God is sometimes associated with various Ascended Masters or cosmic beings, and these beings are treated as divinities, rest assured of two things. The first is that none of the Ascended Masters will accept anyone worshiping them. There is no idolatry in the teachings of the Ascended Masters. They do not expect to be that you are serving them. The principles of the second secret ray of authority and obedience and hierarchy have nothing to do with that kind of idolatrous conduct toward them. They all love the great I am, as do you, and invite you to serve God, to serve the mighty I am presence in all of life, and to pour forth your adoration to, first and foremost, your own mighty I am presence, and then on to the presence, the I am that I am. There is boundless love that we afford the Ascended Masters, just as they do one another. There is a certain diplomatic seventh ray courtesy that is afforded to them, and a respect and a deference given to the greater wisdom that they may have, and insight that they may have, and the authority that is conferred upon them at various levels of the hierarchy. But this has nothing to do with either worship or service to them in that sense. Here again, this was a decision that Jesus could freely have made. He could have succumbed to that allurement of himself, to have thought himself great, and to have abrogated to himself this worldly authority over the kingdoms of this world. Needless to say, many of the Jews of his time, including a few of the disciples even, wanted him to set himself up as a Messiah and a restored king over a worldly kingdom. And he would have none of that. Always putting his attention and the pearl of great price of his own heart in attaining the reunion with his mighty I Am presence. The last of these three temptations is also very telling. And then the tempter brought him to Jerusalem and set him on a pinnacle of the temple and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, cast yourself down from here, for it is written, He shall give his angels charge over thee and keep thee. And in their hands the angels shall bear thee up, lest at any time thou dash thy foot against a stone." And Jesus answered, saying, "It is written, Thou shalt not put the Lord thy God to the test." Or, in the older King James, "Thou shalt not tempt the Lord." This is another point of instruction that all who are on the steep path to Christhood should bear in mind for themselves. In this case, his own outer impulse was that, well, as this powerful being that he is, as this special being that he was above the law. And if he were to deliberately jump off this high point, that God's angels would be obliged to catch him. And there were certain references when the children of Israel were wandering in the wilderness and without water, that they strove mightily with Moses and with Aaron, and that was characterized as putting God to the test. And that is also something that everyone on the path must be aware of as they go along with their practice of the teachings. You might not think that this applies, but it does come into play when life streams, for whatever reason, rationalize the principles of cosmic law. This rationalization is actually characterized in the book of Genesis as the fall, the reason for the fall. You might recall that when God put Adam and Eve in the garden, he pointed out this certain tree, which was the knowledge of good and evil. It was not divine good against mortal evil. It was relative human good versus relative human negativity or evil. And the prohibition was, on the day that thou eat of this tree, thou shalt die. That was the principle of cosmic law. The meaning being that this ignorance and discord that was outside the consciousness of these two disciples would be taken and ingested and brought inside their consciousness in the symbolic act of eating the apple. And then they would be subject to the laws of mortality, which are brought about inevitably by ingesting, taking into one's system, good and evil. When Eve first looked at that fruit, the rationalization came, "Thou shalt not surely die." In other words, the law will not really be the law. And this third temptation of beloved Jesus was of a similar nature. We can think of a few rather arbitrary examples that will be so drastic that hopefully none of you will think that you're being thought of as we mention these. Let's say, for the sake of example, that you make your calls for your tube of light and you're on a busy city street. Now, can you say to yourself, I've just said my tube of light decree. Therefore, I can, with impunity, step off the curb into the path of this oncoming truck. That is what is meant by thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God, or put the Lord to the test. Cosmic law and the principles of cosmic law are not a game. They are not for dilettantes. They are serious business. They are impersonal and universal and no respecter of any man's person. And although this is not intended to incite any superstitious concerns, the fact that anyone should feel like they have to be humanly perfect. On the other hand, individuals should not feel as if they are above the law, that they can transgress the principles of cosmic law and still sidestep the consequences of that it won't apply in their case. When Jesus was embodied as David, he wrote in the Psalms that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. This fear, in this case, the Lord is the impersonal, universal expression of the Godhead as cosmic law, that is no respecter of any man's person. And the fear that is referenced there is a healthy respect and acknowledgement that the law is the law and that one cannot continue to transgress the law with impunity and think that it isn't going to operate in their consciousness. There are so very many ways that this applies. Nowhere greater than in what takes place within each disciple's mind and their feelings. Whenever the attention is drawn to certain things and the mind is fed onto those negative conditions, especially if it does a revolving and a revolving and a revolving of those things, like the organ grinder of the hurdy-gurdy of the organ grinder. If those things are revolved, then misqualification will take place, and it will spill over into the feeling body, and the feelings will inevitably outpicture those momentums. And if this is done consciously and deliberately, regardless of the rationalizations about it, regardless of the excuses or the sophistries about that are the justifications for it, if it falls into that area of misqualification, the consequences are going to come full circle. They may not seem to come immediately, but they will come full circle. because the law is the law. And if things are done repeatedly, persistently, insistently, the ascended masters will not override the free will of the consciousness that has succumbed to the temptation to engage in those activities. I could cite you numberless places in the teachings where it is shown that that is the case. And it is true in your own interactions, forget about all the ascended masters answering your calls in that regard. If there is an area of your own four lower bodies, your own past karmic momentums in the memory body, that whether you know consciously that you are unwilling to surrender it, or whether you subconsciously are unwilling to surrender it. In either of those cases, though you could sit in decrees for 4 hours at a time, invoking the violet flame, the violet flame will not treat an area of your life that you are consciously or subconsciously holding on to. That is how uncanny and impersonal is the law of octaves and the law of free will. So it truly is incumbent upon everyone to really be sure that they are addressing those conditions within their world as Jesus did here, that you know the principles of cosmic law and are able to rely upon the truths of cosmic law. It is written, it is written, it is written. He went back and compared his impulses against what he knew to be cosmic law and used that instruction to override the temptation. And oh, by the way, I think one of the somewhat humorous parts about this is even though Jesus was doing that 3 times, you'll notice this. And the tempter brought him to Jerusalem, set him on a pinnacle of the temple, and said to him, "If you be the Son of God, cast yourself down from here, for it is written, He shall give his angels charge over thee to keep thee." So the carnal mind itself was quoting scripture by way of the temptation. And that too can easily take place to where the outer consciousness will cite some element somewhere and try to justify its behavior on the basis of the teaching. What are you to do when these things happen? Well, as we alluded to several days ago, one of the things is that your Christ presence may well prescribe a dosage of a wake-up call to your outer consciousness, where your outer consciousness has been blind. And it can come in one form of adversity or necessities ray or another, depending on the situation and the individual involved. But it is always intended to shake up the outer consciousness to what it is blind to. And even though the outer consciousness might not be able to immediately put cause and effect together, there is a learning that is going on within the life stream. In the beginning of our invocations to the violet flame, there is, when we call upon the law of forgiveness, an invocation as well, that we be illumined as to the cause of this karma, that we understand and gain the wisdom of whatever that karmic lesson is trying to teach us. The idea being that the sooner we learn the lesson, the sooner the Christ presence doesn't need to prescribe the suffering any longer, and the full action of transmutation by the violet flame can take place. So that is one of the important ways in which those blind spots can be transmuted and overcome. Of course, the leadership of the Ascended Masters through the anointed representatives is also intended to be another such a form of drawing aside the veil on those areas of blindness that individuals are unaware are taking place within themselves. This is done by the grace and the intercession of the Ascended Masters. In this regard, I would like to just cite one area that makes it all the more difficult for the Masters to reach through when there is a process that goes on and on for a period of time that acts within the world of individuals. This citation was inserted by beloved Saint Germain at the very earliest inception of the work, the teachings of the Ascended Masters. It was before the discourses on the I Am were released in Volume 3 of the Discourses, at a time when there was, if any, just a mere handful of local students in association with the first messenger. There would have been, therefore, no outer event that would have been the precipitating cause behind this instruction. Rather, it was something that was intended to be a safeguard for future generations. Here is the instruction given by beloved Saint Germain on this point. First of all, in his invocation here, he calls for vigilance. We offer eternal praise and thanks for that eternal contact with thee, that we may know evermore thy master presence is giving itself every assistance required in maintaining perfect contact with the mighty God self in each, so that we may live, move, and reap the great reward of eternal peace and eternal vigilance, eternally receiving that great light more strongly each day. Within the consciousness of each one is that eternal vigilance, standing on guard, intended to alert the outer consciousness and warn it that it refrain from anything that would create destructive activity, if the individual will only listen to the prompting. Therefore, for any student to yield or lower themselves to vicious gossip is a violent retarding process to his or her growth. It matters not what may seem to be the appearance. Nevertheless, one shall not sit in judgment upon another. Those who do yield to such childishness are opening wide the doors of their world to forces more destructive than the boa constrictor or the tiger that would tear them to pieces. For those two would only destroy the outer body, while gossip, criticism, condemnation build and build and build within the mental bodies such a destructive element that it may take embodiments to rid themselves of it. If the students receiving this Ascended Master instruction cannot resist the vicious onslaught of these accumulated elements, they should withdraw from the classes until such time as they can conquer themselves and are able to once more send love, peace, harmony, and goodwill to one another. Students should understand that entering into this conscious path, this stream of life, they have entered into a sifting process. That sifting process is an allusion to the path of initiation. and whether they will rise on wings of love or fall by the wayside to be swallowed up by the dragon of the outer forces is up to them. The students who have entered upon the conscious path, who wish to proceed and be blessed by the wondrous light anchored in the heart of each one, must spurn criticism and judgment as they would from a poisonous serpent, waiting to strike poison of death into them. The student should understand that in allowing themselves to fall into this most undesirable habit, they do injure themselves. Now, of course, he's not speaking here about a physical death, but he's talking about a corrosive spiritual acid that really eats away at the wholesomeness that should be present in the four lower bodies. The student who still has difficulty controlling their thoughts and feeling harmoniously should understand that when they have entered this radiation of the releases of the Ascended Masters, every faculty of their being is quickened tremendously. And this is his reference to what was shared with you about the path by Olcott, Moria, and Kuthumi, that when you enter this conscious path, things that have been tamped down and have been more or less in a somnambulistic state, all of a sudden they are watered with the light and the power of the presence. And that light amplifies whatever it waters, whatever it encounters, good, bad, or indifferent. Students should understand that when they have entered this radiation, every faculty of their being is quickened. Therefore, they are more sensitive to the undesirable as well as to the good and desirable. I cannot stress too strongly that everyone having free will still has the capacity to govern and control the things that they will think and feel. And they should at all times hold this truth before themselves. The student who spreads gossip, whether it is factual or not, is not only injuring themselves, but may well shut the door for those who accept, unfortunately, the gossip and dwell upon it. Anyone yielding to it should understand how far-reaching is the injury that they do to themselves and their acquaintances. The pouring out of divine love into all situations will enable anyone addicted to this habit to find quick and complete release from all such conditions. I, Saint Germain, rejoice exceedingly when one with great inner strength is able to resist and refuse the acceptance of these subtle suggestions, subtle destructive suggestions, who is able to stand firmly with and in the mighty presence. Keep it up, and you shall hear the bells of freedom and liberty chiming in the great rhythm of eternal life. We see and know the beauty of everyone who is brought into these classes. They have been brought that their mighty presence, they might know the mighty presence of as their divine self. It makes my heart ache to think that anyone might shut the door to the great blessings and light that are on their threshold. So again, the way that this applies in the case of the instruction on the temptations of beloved Jesus is that rationalizations and justifications don't change the principle at work. And if anyone engages in those things and thinks, oh, well, God knows that I don't really, that I'm going to do the violet flame. I have my own good motives for doing this that will override it. It is a case of tempting, putting the Lord to the test, putting the law to the test. And inevitably, that will come to naught. There will not be a wholesome development come out of those things. One week later, he goes on in this vein. Gossip. This is an urgent warning. I am going to say something to you, dear students, that to some might be shocking, but it must be said. Could individuals see how they clothe themselves when they wallow in vicious or unkind thought or gossip, they would scream for deliverance. I would not stain the consciousness of your God presence by attempting to describe what actually takes place. If one really knows that there is only God in action, we can readily see how perfectly unnecessary it is for anyone to permit the outer to lament about such things. The blessed students who sincerely want to know the truth will face it, buckle on their armor of the mighty presence within, and conquer it, no matter how fierce the battle with themselves. If at all points they keep themselves reminded that there is only God in action at all times, they will find that this great struggle is diminished 1,000-fold. The next element of this temptation occurs at the very conclusion of beloved Jesus' public ministry. And it is that temptation in the garden. Then cometh Jesus with them unto a place called Gethsemane, and said to the disciples, Abide here while I go and pray yonder. And he took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, and began to be sorrowful and heavy. And he said to them, My soul is exceedingly sorrowful. Tarry here and watch with me. He went a little further, fell on his face, and prayed, saying, My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. But nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. And the second time he came and found them asleep and said, Peter, could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you enter not into temptation. The spirit may be willing, but the flesh is weak. He went his way again and prayed, My Father, if this cup may pass from me, away from me, except I drink it, thy will be done. And he came and found them asleep, for their eyes were heavy. And he left them and went away and prayed the 3rd time, saying the same words. Then cometh he to his disciples and said to them, Sleep now, take your rest. The hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. Behold, he is at hand that doth betray me. It might seem to be so deceptively simple to say, well, not my will, but thine be done. Nevertheless, it means that all of those other clamoring elements within the outer self need to be subdued, and the exercise of the heart to the God presence put first in each one's life. That is, again, an example of the temptations of the use of power. As a free will embodied life stream, Jesus had the ability to avoid that trial of the crucifixion. He could have done any number of things. The power lay within the palm of his hand to do that. And the great victory of that was his being able to put down the impulses of his natural self, his four lower bodies, and submit to his mighty I Am presence, even in that state of death. This is what we have said always about the Christ virtues, as they are elaborated on and as you understand them. They are counterintuitive. They are not what human beings do. They are all actually a deference to the virtues of the mighty I Am presence and an attempt to allow that presence to follow through. What all of the students of the light can rely upon is that when they surrender to the will of their own beloved mighty I Am presence, that even though it might appear that that is self-sacrificing and is somehow going to be less desirable to themselves, the truth of the matter is that what is happening is that the memory body is being surrendered back to the mighty I Am presence. The voices of the mind are being surrendered back to the presence. The feeling world is being surrendered back. The physical body is being surrendered back. As Jesus said in a release many years ago, all that I had thought my own, my name, my fame, my contacts, fears and blames, cast them all within thy flame. And as you are able to achieve that ultimate identification with your own mighty I Am presence and surrender to your mighty I Am presence, you have fulfilled the law of octaves. And then your own God presence and the ascended masters are free to take that decision and that exercise of will on your part and fly to your side and perform the miracles in your life that you need to have accomplished. Regardless of your station in life, in this outer world, you may trust that there is a plan for your life, a divine plan that is supremely good. In fact, it is so good that it's good that you don't know about it, because it would be too daunting. You wouldn't think that you were up to it. And outwardly, if you're considering only your human self, you'd be right. But your mighty I Am presence, when the outer identity is really turned back over to the I Am presence, your mighty I Am presence as the doer within you is able to rise to the level of accomplishing and performing through you the work that needs to be done. To all Ascended Master students, as well as to the torchbearers of the temple, if you can only realize the plan that your presence has in store for you in this life, the good that is laid up for you, the divine design that is there for you, that can come forth if you are able to have that courage and strength of surrender fully and completely to your own beloved mighty I Am presence. It means that you take everything in your life, as you might recall the initiation that came to El Moria as Abraham, There were few things in the world at that time he treasured. He'd gone most of his adult life thinking he would never have a legitimate firstborn son. Finally, when that son came and he doted on him and he was the apple of his eye, then the initiation came as to whether or not he would put his mighty I Am presence first above the love of that son. Granted, that trial was drastic and arbitrary as it has been portrayed, but it comes down to the willingness for Abraham to sublimate what was within himself that he wanted and loved, and turning it back over to his God presence and trusting that, knowing best and having goodwill towards his life stream, that God would adjudicate matters in the best possible way. With all of the other application on cosmic law, all of the other following of the precepts, avoidance of the fetters and so forth, if there is not this ultimate givingness of one's all to the presence in that ultimate act of surrender and turning every part of one's selfhood over to the presence, it won't be possible to go through to the final stages of those initiations. Moving on from this stage of things, we return to the theme of the goal of life for the Godhead charioteer as the victory of the ascension. In regards to that, you know, or perhaps you do, that knowing of that goal, choosing that goal for yourself, is itself a tremendous assistance in your ability to bring it forth. What you undoubtedly have not factored in is the degree of acceleration that needs to go on within the physical body as well as the finer bodies. Beloved Cyclopeia, many years ago, drew aside the veil and went back to the moment when mankind first lowered their attention from the mighty I Am presence at that moment when there was the fall from grace. Here is how Cyclopeia put that moment. We're rehearsing it because we are going to have to go back the same pathway that mankind descended on and return back to that higher state. The so-called astral and psychic world exists from the Earth's surface to 7,000 feet above sea level. Within that is all of the human discord ever generated on the earth by mankind through thousands of centuries in which humanity has lived upon the earth. The first two golden ages were magnificent, during which there was no imperfection. Then as mankind began to what? And notice this line, claim the power of the presence for themselves. The very thing in those temptations, to usurp the power, and turned their thoughts downward. This drew about them the densities which shut in the light, which had previously made their bodies luminous. Before the density was drawn about the body, as far as the hands could see, as far as the hands could reach, there was a self-luminous radiance, visible to everyone's outer sight. Today, in the octaves of the ascended masters, they still communicate by flashing their thought as light to one another, conversing far more by this radiance than by the spoken word. Mankind are returning home into that same great perfection, because now the densities of the physical body, which have produced the tremendous struggles of the outer world, those densities are gradually being dissolved. The density of the body came about as discord entered and mankind descended below the levels of harmony. In the process of the transfiguration, of the resurrection, and the ascension, but most especially the transfiguration and the resurrection, there must be a re-acceleration of the light in the physical body. It might be easy to say, but to appreciate the significance of that is so very, very important. Interestingly enough, when Plato was trying to describe this same thing, he explains in the Phaedrus how every soul, when it first came to this world, had wings of light, wings rather. And when mankind fell, the wings atrophied and fell off. And when a few started to be philosophers and lovers of wisdom, that slowly but surely the stubble and the stumps of those wings started pressing out and pressing out, causing a certain amount of understandable discomfort, but also literally regrowing the wings. Wings, whether they are on angels or, in this case, the soul of man, are really the human interpretation of the light that is intended to flow through the physical body. The light is intended to be that powerful, that it comes forth from the body as a self-luminous radiance. In the case of the transfiguration, that was one of those stages at which this preparation was going on within the world of Jesus so that his physical body would be accelerated sufficiently to be able to endure the intensities of the resurrection flame that occurred as on this very day, Easter Day, when that resurrection from the tomb of mortality takes place. The luminosity goes forth from the threefold flame of the heart, the heart flame balanced. Once the pathway of the light, which involves, of course, the raising up of the mother light from the base of the spine, which is accomplished because there is a guarding of the sacred fire in the physical body, so that as that light comes down, it is not misused in the kind of misuses of the sacred fire described by Sanat Kumara a few days ago. But as it comes down, it goes down and goes back up, down and up, down and up. And little by little, the heart flame, when it's time for those final initiations, begins to expand and begins to unfold. In the etheric double of the physical body, there is a Buddhic web, an expression of the Buddhic web that exists in all of the bodies. It exists in the mental, in the emotional, and in the memory body. It comes forth from the Christ presence and the electronic body. It is on this Buddhic web that the design, down to the cells, down to the organs, every element of the physical body is there in that gold print of the Buddhic web. And it is along the warp and woof of that Buddhic web of life that the light of the crystal cord flows. And when it is time for the transfiguration, the first impulse of that expansion of the heart is performed by the mighty I Am Presence. And it comes down from the electronic body, where it has been shown that power, it takes immense power to cause that self-luminosity to take place, will be guarded and will be returned back to God in the adoration and worship and putting God first. So that luminosity comes forth. And actually, it's a very interesting association. When that luminosity is sufficient and the light is sufficient, it will be so strong as to overcome the force of gravity. And the individual, the physical body can still be physical, but it will be weightless. Perhaps some of you from time to time have experienced a touch of that intensity. When the goddess of light comes many times, because her momentum is light, you might feel that consciousness of light. Certainly, when Archangel Gabriel comes, the angel of the Annunciation, and the one who helps to focus that resurrection flame, when he comes, the so-called wings, but the light from him will go out for miles and miles, and it will be a tremendous outpouring of that intensity. So when that initiation of the transfiguration begins, it will flow through your physical body. It will be made possible because of your devotion to Serapis Bey and the purities of the laws of life and the disciplines of the laws of life. It's not just a moral discipline, it's not just a yogic discipline, but it's a discipline to the impersonal principles of cosmic law that allow that light to safely expand. And when it first comes forth, it could be that you will feel as if every cell of your body has become a pair of lungs, and they are breathing in pure oxygen, which in fact, they are breathing in what's better than oxygen, which is pure life, pure divine prana flowing along the crystal cord that flows in and begins the process of the threefold flame of the heart expanding. So that light goes forth, then the threefold flame of the presence is able to expand it even more. And there is an acceleration. It's like going from low gear to mid gear. And in that mid gear range, then the threefold flame expands and unfolds more from within itself, always under the direction of the I Am Presence, always by the assistance of the Ascended Masters who stand round about to guard and safeguard every element of this process. And first, the red blood turns to golden light in accordance with the golden pink light of the Buddhic web. And more, the physical is drawn up together with the mental and the emotional and the memory bodies. They are no longer dense and subject to the law of gravity, but they are weightless. They rise into and up the crystal cord, where they are lifted into the higher mental body of the Christ presence. And as soon as they are reabsorbed into the higher mental body, all of the whatever might still remain of any vestiges of age or infirmity, and whatever might have been the worldly garments that the individual was wearing at the time, all of those melt into the garments of perfection at the level of the Christ presence. And the individual then is functioning as the resurrected life stream. Ordinarily, for most people, the divine plan is to immediately have this followed up by the victory of the ascension. In Jesus' case, he had other work to do before that final ascension. And so there were the 40 days from Easter to Ascension Day. He also elected, because of the doubting nature of his and the incredulous nature of his disciples, to permit the temporary retention of some of the signs of the crucifixion so that they would be able to satisfy themselves, the disciples, that it was indeed beloved Jesus. So he operated for those 40 days at the level of the Christ presence as the resurrected Jesus Christ. He has shared with us that he recalls that first Easter morning, how as he stood there before the angel had rolled away the stone from the tomb, that he took the the garment, the shroud that his body had been wrapped in, and carefully folded it and laid it on the stone slab in the sepulchre where his body had rested for those 3 days. And he thought to himself, this is the last act of mortality that I will ever perform as an unascended life stream. It's the final event of my long pilgrimage here in this world. So now you have the 4 lower bodies drawn up into the Christ presence. For those of you who are part of Acropolis Sophia and have been a part of our instruction on how the one being in the heart of God in the great central sun has emanated forth the various hypostases of all of the realms down to the physical realm, you can understand that creation as a coming to be has actually come forth into this outer world from that level of the great central sun, coming down one world at a time. So this is simply the in-breath of that out-breath, that earlier out-breath. It requires a great deal of power, but it is natural. It is the divine plan. It was intended from the beginning. At this stage of the resurrection, of course, there is no imperfection in the level of the Christ presence, so all signs of age or infirmity are gone, and the fivefold nature of that resurrected one is able to move with the speed of thought everywhere or anywhere across the earth and lower those vibrations to be visible to those who are present once again. Even though Jesus sometimes was present, as in the road to Emmaus, those who were with him did not any longer have the ability to recognize him for who he was until he elevated their consciousness and their attunement up once again. When those 40 days were complete, he arranged for the disciples, his beloved mother, and roughly 500 witnesses to accompany him to the Ascension Hill. And there, in the presence of those witnesses, the great crystal ray of his own electronic body descended and enveloped that Christ's presence. And the 4 lower bodies that were now absorbed into the higher mental body became absorbed once again into, and rising up that crystal ray, were drawn up and merged with, blended with the electronic body. at which time, for the first moment, he became the ascended master, Jesus. Any number of references have been made to the fact that there was a definite intent that this be done publicly so that there would be the impressing on the witnesses of what they had observed, but more importantly, because by that public demonstration, he was able to create a record in the ethers, in the four lower bodies, as well as all the way to Akasha, of that physical ascension. And that record is like a beacon light that has been shining out into the consciousness of the planet ever thereafter. How tragic that the whole purpose, or one of the most important of all of these purposes, was for Jesus to settle the question once and for all: what is the nature of mankind and what is their destiny? The whole drama of his birth was orchestrated to confirm that he was born through the natural process. The drama of his going to the temple at age 12, growing up in the village of Nazareth. All of this was so that there would not be any question about the fact that he was presumably a person, a human being. Maybe one won't say ordinary, but that he was a person. Many times in the Gospels, he's referred to as not as the Son of Man, as well as the Son of God, meaning that everyone was willing to agree that he was born of mortal parents. And so the plan had been, and still is, for mankind to learn the lesson that what he did, all could do. His was intended to have been a public demonstration of what everyone else should do. He said, "Be ye perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect." He said, "Greater things than these that I do, you shall do, because I go to my Father." So many other things were intended to be the legacy of his mission, to settle this question of who and what is a person. At least Christianity has preserved, for the most part intact, the tradition that there is the possibility of one Son of God. But now it is time for the Christian world, Protestant, Catholic, and all persuasions, to transcend that which they had thought in the past. Instead of immediately going back and reverting to the idea of themselves as puny, limited, mortal human beings, and making Jesus out to be the exception to the case, instead of doing that, now is the time to understand that this was the shining example that everyone is capable of achieving. Although many of the ascended masters that we know and love, who have shared this world with us during the last several thousands of years, did not make the same dramatic public demonstration of their ascension, they too have that attainment and that momentum. And it is a part of the divine plan that in those final moments, when the time comes, that they will stand round about in assistance to the one who is in going through that process. As much assistance as they render, there is still the role that must and is played by the Christ presence and the I am presence of that life stream. Those of you who are going to take that initiation will rise into your Christ presence. You will, as was described just yesterday, You will hold connection in the Christ presence with the perfection of the electronic body and still have the connection of the magnetic odic cord, the crystal cord, to the etheric double, to the emotional, the mental, and the memory bodies as well. And you, as that Christ, will trigger the release of the resurrection flame, which is this second stage expansion of the threefold flame. You will trigger that release through the four lower bodies, drawing them up into that Christ presence. And then, in cooperation with the electronic body, be drawn up into to that blessed electronic body, becoming the ascended master. All that you do as you identify yourself as your mighty I Am presence in action is a rehearsal for that process. Though we may not have the time any longer at this class to do so, you are commended to beloved Serapis Bey and the Brotherhood of Luxor. You will want to befriend beloved Serapis, to put your arm inside of his, clasp heart and head with him, and tell him that you embrace whatever are the requirements that he may discern are needed in your life stream to put you on a program of following the golden precepts so that you can bring about the acceleration of your physical and your finer bodies, as well as the purification of your memory body, of your soul, balancing your karma. But having this acceleration begin right now, having the caduceus action of the mother light reestablished in and through your physical body, and whatever else might be along those lines for your life stream. As you befriend him and accept his assistance and receive from him from time to time the blush of transfiguration, of resurrection and ascension, you will come to know such a sublime purity of the purity of God consciousness that is there in the Ascended Master octaves. And you will come to know that there is a regularity, a laser-like harmonious flow of light that when it is initiated knows truly no duality or opposition. And you will know that when that light of the ascension flame, focused by your presence, focused by Serapis, when it lays hold on your bodies and anoints them with that light, that these initiations will be yours as well. And you will look back on whatever might be the exertions, the austerities, the probations, the stepping stones, and bless every one of those steps that might have seemed quite strenuous at the time that you're going through them. Not only will you win the victory for yourself, but every one of you who wins that will be opening a new ladder of light, a new wider doorway into the Ascended Master octaves, and creating an updraft of Ascended Master light and aspiration that will build and build and build as we move forward to the dawning golden age.